evolution has random elements, but overall it is an ordered process, it is a complex process, it is a cooperative process, and as we have come to understand, it is a cognitive process, because according to the so-called Santiago theory of cognition, about which I've written a lot, the very essential dynamics of self-organization is cognitive. So that's a very different view of evolution from the sort of lottery point of view of neo-Darwinism.
Yeah, and you just gave me the key for the next question, because I remember you, and I'm going to paraphrase because I don't know the exact quote, but I remember you saying something, I think it was even in the Turning Point, which was that if you follow the converging crises that we see around the planet at the moment, the ecological crisis, now you could say the ecological and the climate crisis, the social crisis and social breakdown, and the ever faster cycles of economic crisis, if you follow all these rivers upstream, you come to one single source, which is a crisis of perception or a crisis of consciousness. And to some extent, the Santiago theory of cognition is one of the first scientific theories that overcomes part of that crisis of consciousness, that dualism between mind and matter, self and world, nature, culture, the way that we tend to distinguish things in a Cartesian framework rather than pay attention to the dimension of mind in what we're observing.
Yeah, I did talk about the crisis of perception, I think, in the Turning Point in the early 1980s. Mm-hmm. And I may have got that phrase from Hazel Henderson, mm-hmm. the radical economist who is an old friend of mine. So what we're talking about here is a very profound change of worldview that has been happening over the last half century and longer, a change of paradigms, essentially from seeing the world as a machine to understanding it as a network. And a network, of course, is a pattern of relationships, and therefore, in order to understand networks, we need to understand patterns and relationships, and that's what systems thinking is all about. And that's why I call the new paradigm a systemic or systems view of the world. And so this has a profound effect on all our activities and endeavors, professionally and personally, because what we're dealing with in our personal and professional lives is usually living systems, whether we talk about the economy or education or healthcare or management, all that has to do with life. And so the profound change from seeing life as a clockwork, as a machine, to understanding it as a network of processes and as a cognitive network. And this is now what the Santiago theory developed by Umberto Maturana and Francisco Varela at the University of Santiago in Chile. What this theory says is that the dynamics of organization, of self-organization of living organisms or any living systems is essentially a cognitive process. This is a great expansion of the view of cognition. Cognition is the self-organizing activity of living systems. So when an organism perceives something, that stimulus or that disturbance, as Maturana calls it, will enter the organism, and the organism will respond to it with certain structural changes according to its nature. The environment triggers the response, triggers the structural changes, but doesn't determine them. And the organism actually selects what to notice and what not to notice. When we adopt this view of seeing life around us as cognitive systems, and therefore as intelligent, this will profoundly influence the way we deal with our environment. If the environment really were a machine, then the best way to deal with it would be to control it. That's what you do when you drive your car. You need to control it, otherwise you get into trouble. The way one deals with a machine is, to control it. But if the environment is a living system, a living being, an intelligent being, then the best way to deal with it is not via domination and control, but via dialogue and cooperation and partnership. And there's so much we can learn from nature. So rather than controlling nature, or rather than extracting things from nature for our use, we can extract knowledge from nature and can learn from nature, because natural systems have solved many of the problems we're struggling with, millions of years ago. There's this whole movement of eco-design and biomimicry that tries to learn from nature and copy nature to design human structure.
I'm tempted to, in terms of the language use, because we're talking about the upstream perception change or the consciousness change, the way we use the word nature, and you've just done it yourself, and Janine does it with biomimicry, it's learning from nature. When we say from, we actually put nature back out there again. But of course, what we're really talking about is that we as human beings are part of that process. And we learn as nature from the wider community of life.
Yeah, that's right. But of course, when you interact with somebody, there are connections, but there are also differences. I learn from you, and you learn from me, and we both learn from nature.
As the wider context. And for me, so much about, to some extent, the Santiago theory also speaks to what is life. But in the work that I do with bringing in this concept of regeneration as life as a regenerative community, to understand how life, we were talking about it earlier, these patterns of complexification also then in local pockets need breakdown of ossified structures that no longer serve in order to unleash the possibility for new connections. And in your book, The Systems View of Life, you have two subchapters. One of them asks the question, what is life? And then you also ask the question, what is death? And I think that the second part, we often culturally are tabooing death as something negative, but in many ways, Goethe, more than 200 years ago, said that death is life's ingenious way to create plenty of life. So I would love for you to speak to that dynamic relationship between life and death, and how that might inform us to participate in that longer cycle more wisely.
Yeah, I didn't know this saying of Goethe. That's very beautiful. And so, of course, the central question that I've been exploring for the last 30 years is the question, what is life? The age-old question, what is life? And so when you go around to biology departments and ask the professors there, what's your definition of life? Then they tend to focus on the structures of living systems. So they might say, well, the essential difference between a rock and a plant is the fact that a plant is made of cells all living systems are either individual cells or made of cells. A rock is not made of cells. And within the cells, there are very large molecules, macromolecules, like proteins, lipids, DNA, RNA, with a carbon backbone. And and they don't exist in non-living systems. And some biologists might even say, well, life is a living organism is a chemical system made of DNA. So all you have to do is really look for DNA. If you see DNA, it's alive. If you don't see DNA, it's not alive. Well, this sounds very simple, but it is flawed, because dead organisms also contain DNA. When an organism dies, the DNA doesn't disappear. It's just a molecule and it stays there. So the difference between a living and a dead organism, or a living and a non-living organism, is the process of life, is what poets and philosophers for ages have called the breath of life. And in modern scientific language, the breath of life is called metabolism. And this is something I learned also from Lynn Margulis. She defines metabolism as a constant flow of energy and matter through a network of processes, of chemical reactions in a cell, for example, which allows the organism to continually regenerate itself, repair itself, and perpetuate itself. So in this definition of metabolism, there are two aspects, the flow aspect and the network aspect. Mm-hmm. And my synthesis of this whole systems view of life is essentially a synthesis between the flow aspect and the network aspect. So the flow aspect was researched and developed by Ilya Prigogine in his concept of dissipative structures, of systems being continuously far from equilibrium, subject to constant flows of energy and matter. And then the network aspect was developed by Maturana and Varela, who discovered that the key characteristic of these living networks is that they are self-generating, self-producing, self-making. And they coined a Greek term which literally means self-making, and that's autopoiesis. So these autopoietic networks continually regenerate themselves, replace their structures, transform their structures, and regenerate themselves. And you must like that very much, because you have written this book about regenerative cultures, and regeneration is a term that has become very popular lately, thanks partly to your work. And so we can say that if you really understand the systemic nature of life in terms of autopoiesis, that a living system is a regenerative system. That's the very definition of life.